Hi, everybody, and welcome to the latest vodcast from Honors Biology at Desert Ridge High School. I'm Mr. Galladay, and today we're going to talk about the ecology of populations. This is a good place to update the table of contents in your notebook because here we go. We'll start off by redefining what we mean by a population. It's a group of individuals of the same species that live in a particular place. Of course, we know that a species is a group of individuals that are able to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So that is our definition of a population that we've been talking about for quite some time now. Populations have different characteristics that we can use to describe them. First of all, usually the size of the population, that is to say, how many individuals are there? What's the geographic distribution? How big of an area is that? Once we know those two, we can compute the density. That is to say, how many individuals live per square kilometer or per square meter? What's the density of the population? How close together are they? We also like to know how the population is growing or not growing, and the immigration and emigration rates, which tells us how many individuals are coming in or leaving a population, as well as birth and death rates. Those four factors together give us some idea of how rapidly the population is growing or shrinking. Well, the way populations grow, to understand this, we have to understand this idea of exponential growth rate. And to do that, I'm going to have you just put your pencil down for just a second and think about this. Imagine a scenario where you're offered two different jobs. Each job is 8 hours a day for 30 days. The first one's going to pay $1,000 an hour, and you might be saying, Mr. G, that is just too good. I don't even have to hear what the second one is. Well, let me tell you about the second job. The first job pays a penny a day, but they're going to double it each day. So the question is, which job do you want? Well, that seems like a no-brainer, but let's look at what happens over time. Here's job one, making $8,000 a day. Here's job two, paying a penny a day. Well, 2 pennies, 4 pennies, 8 pennies, and so on. Well, what happens over the next 10 days? Well, predictably $8,000 a day. This job continues growing. So at the end of 20 days, this person's almost making as much per day as this person. But look what happens over the next 10 days. At the end of the 30 days, this person has only made $240,000, while this person has brought home $10,737,000 and some change. So while it seems incredible, that is the power of exponential growth. This is the way the two jobs would look if you graph them. And so here you see a linear growth rate, which is job number one. It's growing linearly. Here you see job number two, which is growing exponentially. Well, this idea doesn't just have implications for crazy job offers. It also has implications for living things, such as bacteria. Bacteria, as you know, divide by, they reproduce by dividing in two. So we have 1 bacterium, 2, 4, 8, 16, and so on. So when we graph the population of these bacteria, well, guess what? There is a nice exponential growth curve. If we look at not only bacteria, but if we also look at human growth over the last few hundred years, we see much the same pattern. We see an exponential growth rate. So it turns out that under ideal conditions, all populations can grow at an exponential growth rate. Not just humans, not just bacteria, but any population. This, of course, was the insight that Charles Darwin had in reaction to the work of Thomas Malthus. He realized that all populations have the potential of growing faster than their environments can support. Well, if this were true, that means that the Earth should be completely covered in some kind of living things, just like this person is being covered with honeybees. But we know that doesn't happen, so why not? Well, it doesn't happen because of these things that we call limiting factors. And limiting factors, as the name implies, are the factors that can control or limit population growth. It turns out there are two types of limiting factors. The first type are what we call density independent factors, and the second type are density dependent factors. Density independent factors are factors that are not affected by the population density. That means they're independent of population density. Doesn't matter how many individuals there are or how dense the population is, these factors act the same on a small population or a large population. These are usually abiotic things. Think of disturbances. So abiotic meaning non-living. So these are things like extreme temperatures, droughts, floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, volcanoes. These are things, you see a result of a flood here, which has a short-term devastating effect. Here's where a tornado went through a forest, and as you can see, it pretty much knocked down all the trees where that tornado touched down. Here's an even more devastating result of a volcano eruption. This is Mount St. Helens shortly after it erupted back in 1980. Now, as destructive as these factors appear in the short term, it turns out they actually do not have as strong of an effect long term as the density dependent factors. So, for example, this is Mount St. Helens in 1980, and if we look at the same area today, well, this second picture on the right was taken 25 years after the picture on the left, and you can see that after that amount of time, plants are beginning to grow back, trees are beginning to grow back. So these populations are in fact able to recover from even something as devastating as this eruption. So what are these density dependent factors that are able to have such an impact on population growth? Well, they are the things that of course that are do depend on the number of individuals in the population. That is to say that they are dependent on population density. Another way to think about these are that these don't have much of an effect on a small population, but as the population gets larger and larger and larger, they limit the population more and more and more. So they're going to have a very little effect on a small population, but a huge effect on a large population. These are usually biotic factors, and we'll see that there are 4 different types, and we'll talk about each of them. The first one is competition. And by competition, usually living things are competing for things like food, shelter, nesting sites, sunlight, and so forth. In a larger population, these individuals are going to have to spend more time, more energy competing, and that is time and energy that they would not be able to spend looking for food and so on. They've got to spend time trying to avoid their competitors. Lack of resources. As populations get larger, they require more resources. So again, that means that now these individuals have to spend more time, more effort finding resources just because of the fact that they're going to be scarcer. They're going to be in more limited supply. A very large population may not even be able to find sufficient resources for further growth. This is just as a direct result of the larger the population, the harder it is to get resources for that population. Another aspect is that as populations get larger, this makes a better situation for disease organisms. So for parasites, it's much easier in a dense population to pass disease organisms from one individual to another because they're living in closer proximity. So the crowding from an overpopulated population actually makes it easier to develop diseases. And then the last thing is predation. Anytime you have a good population year, so for these moose, if they have a good year and have lots of babies, well, guess what? That means that provides even more food for the wolves. So the moose might be feeling like they just can't win. Even in years when they have lots of babies, they have a good year, that means that's a good year for the wolves as well because they have the predators now have more food available. So these are our 4 different density dependent factors. Oh, this is a graph that shows populations on Isle Royale National Park, which is up in the middle of Lake Superior, up between Canada and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So you see this one time right here when the population of the the moose went up a little bit, and so in response to that, the wolves had a really good run. Their population went up quite a bit, and then came down once the moose population came down. Well, this suggests the next thing that we're going to talk about, which is a logistic growth curve. So here you see something which is not a exponential growth curve, although it looks like it at the beginning. In the first two phases, A and B, we see essentially a exponential growth curve up till about right here. And then at this point, right about here, we see that exponential growth starts to slow down. And this is when these density dependent factors start slowing that population growth, right? So as it gets up to here, the population growth is going to slow down. Once that population gets this point, we've reached what we call carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is the let me go back here. Carrying capacity, as we'll see in just a minute, is the largest population size that an environment can support over a long period of time. So carrying capacity, as we've just said, this is the highest population that an environment can support over a long period of time. So as you saw in that previous graph of moose population and wolf population, the population is not necessarily stable. It bounces up and down, but it will bounce up and down around this carrying capacity. Here's rather a dramatic example of a bunch of people on a beach, and so this is a relatively austere habitat. That is to say, there's not a lot there in the way of resources for these people to eat. So the reason that this area can have this many people on it is, of course, because they are going to get their food and their shelter and their clothing from somewhere else. You can imagine if you had this many people that were entirely dependent on the habitat that we can see here for their food, clothing, and shelter, that habitat would probably not be able to support that large of a population, at least not over a long period of time. The population growth does not always go in a nice, neat curve like this. This population growth is sometimes rather messy. It'll overshoot that carrying capacity and then may bounce up and down, as we saw in the wolf and moose population picture. But even when that happens, we can generally figure out what the carrying capacity is just in this way, because the population is going to sort of oscillate around that carrying capacity point. When we model population growth, we're usually interested in four different types of factors. We're interested in the birth rate, which is how many individuals are born, and the death rate, which we usually express in the number of deaths per 1,000 individuals. In addition, we want to know, well, how many individuals are moving into this area and how many individuals are moving out of that area. Again, when we talk about population growth in this way, we're usually thinking of human population, but this can apply just as well to any population. Animals, just like people, they move from place to place. They're not necessarily stuck in a particular location. They have opportunities to move to different habitats, and they sometimes do. Well, this is a good place to hold up this particular set of notes. I'm going to leave you with this picture of our beautiful little Earth floating off there in space above this very austere habitat of the moon, the surface of the moon, which can't support any human life by itself, but we're 100% dependent on all the resources available on this pretty blue planet. I'm Mr. Galladay for Honors Biology at Desert Ridge High School, and I hope you have a great day.